The stroke menu allows us to control how our brush stroke is applied to the surface. Now, we've already seen in the quick start video and in the interface guide the stroke palette here. Now, the stroke palette gives us a limited amount of options and various strokes. Now, all of these elements are actually cloned out of the stroke menu at the top of the screen here. So if we drag this off, you'll see that we've got all of our stroke controls here. So at its most simple, we have the standard brush with the dot stroke. Now, what this does is it takes whatever alpha we have selected and it drags it along that stroke. So if we change to a directional alpha, something like the arrow, let's find the arrow here. There we go, alpha 33. You'll see that that drags that arrow alpha along that path. Now, the dot stroke is very, very similar to the freehand stroke. You see, they're basically the same stroke. Now, there's a variety of other strokes available here. The second most commonly used stroke is drag rectangle. Now, drag rectangle takes whatever alpha you have selected and drags out an instance of it on the surface. So this is really nice for texture stamping. For example, if I go to the light box and go to the alpha menu, I can load up, for example, leathery skin. With the drag rectangle stroke, I can apply this like a texture stamp. I can rotate it and scale it as I'm drawing it on the surface. This is really, really useful when we're texturing. Now, when we're painting, we'll probably use the spray stroke. And if you watch the video on polypaint, we talk about this extensively. The spray stroke, sometimes I'll use for detailing. If I change my alpha now to, say, alpha 7, and then drag along the surface, you see what it's doing is it's scattering that alpha. It's spraying it on the surface. Now, if I go to RGB and go to Color Fill Object, I've now filled the object with the selected color, which is white. I'll turn off Z-Add, and now I'm going to change my color selection to red. Now, as I'm drawing, I'm painting with this broken up spatter effect. Now, there's two spray strokes. There's color spray and spray. I never use color spray simply because the spray stroke I'm mostly using for painting and I don't want it to modulate my color. There is a color slider here. If I turn this up, you'll notice that it modulates between my two selected colors. And generally, that's not something I find desirable. I want to put down the exact color I've selected. However, if you do want some little variations, you can turn that up. You can also adjust your placement to control how spread out the spray pattern is. Let's get back to our original sphere. Now, going back to the standard brush, we'll go to the freehand stroke and alpha 1. Now, as we're drawing on the surface, you'll notice that there is this, let's go to sculpting instead of painting. There is this little red line. You might have a hard time seeing it right there. It's quite short. It's just a little red line that's trailing my brush. That is called lazy mouse. If we go to the stroke menu and open up lazy mouse, you see lazy mouse is turned on, and we have a lazy radius control here, as well as lazy step, smooth, and snap. The most important slider here will be lazy radius. If I turn this up, it's going to increase the length of that line. That just simply creates a little delay on my brush stroke, so I can correct for any little wiggles in the hand as I'm sculpting. It allows me to create a very precise stroke. This is very, very handy if you're doing things like seams, for example. If I want to carve a seam into a surface, I can place it precisely by using lazy mouse. Now, there's another option here under lazy mouse called backtrack. If I turn on backtrack and then go to line, I get something that looks like this. It draws a line on the surface, and then as I draw back and forth, I get this sort of effect. Now, that doesn't appear to be very, very useful because we need to change some of our settings. Right now, we're not actually tracking the curvature of the surface beneath our stroke, so we need to turn track curvature all the way up. So our stroke will follow the curvature of that sphere. So now I draw a line, and here you see it's creating a line that goes in between those 2 points, but it's not straight. That's why we want to turn on snap to track. What this does is it forces our stroke to follow the line and it tracks the curvature throughout the stroke. So we'll draw that line again. And now when I backtrack along that stroke, it will replay, giving me that perfect line. Now we also have another one here called path. And path, again, is very, very handy for things like seams. If I start drawing a path, you see it gives me this, this green line. Now, as soon as I backtrack, it's going to follow that line. So I'm going to draw the stroke, and as soon as that stroke backtracks, it's going to follow it. And you see it snapping it to that line. So this is perfect for creating complex curves that follow a precise path. Now, another option that's really useful in this is under modifiers. Under modifiers, I have the replay last button, and I have set a custom hotkey here for Alt-1. If I'm not mistaken, the default hotkey for this is the number 1, but I've customized my hotkeys in Zbrush. I use this for what I call sneaking up on forms. I try not to get the perfect stroke right out of the gate. So for example, I'll create a path and then backtrack it, and you'll see that stroke is very, very light. Now I'm not going to do another stroke, but I'm going to press Alt-1, and that replays that stroke every time I press Alt-1. This is really handy with the pinch brush. If I select the pinch brush, turn on lazy mouse, turn on backtrack, line, snap to track, and turn my track curvature all the way up, I can get something like this, where it's pinching, and then I'll replay that stroke multiple times, and you see it gives me this nice sharp edge, but there's stretched polygons there. But because I've pinched it so tightly, if I run the smooth brush along it, it cleans that up really nicely. So let's do another pinch here. I'll press the Alt key while I do it this time, so it pinches in. And you see that pinches in. And again, we've got a little bit of stretched polys there, but that's no problem. Run the smooth brush along it, and it cleans that up. Run another pinch brush here. Replay that stroke, and then smooth out those edges. So you see the effect that we get here is a nice precise pinch. That's really, really useful when we're doing hard surface or I'm trying to create planes. I'll use that replay stroke. Replay stroke also works really nicely when we're texture stamping. Like I said, I try not to get the perfect stroke right out of the gate because it's a bit difficult to do that. Also, it doesn't lend itself to creating a nice subtlety. So if I go back to drag rectangle and select my leathery skin alpha, turn my Z intensity down, and then let's turn off backtrack. And we'll draw that texture stamp out and then press Alt-1 to replay our stroke. Each time I replay it, it deepens and sharpens that stroke. It repeats that stroke so I can gently build up to the level of detail that I want. Now, again, I call that sneaking up on forms. That replay stroke modifier is super handy whenever I think you're detailing or using the pinch brush or trying to sharpen a precise line. Now, also under the stroke menu, you'll find that we have the controls for curves. Here we have curve, where we turn on curve mode. Now, curve mode, if you watch the video on insert mesh brushes, I talk about creating your own custom curve brushes. But let's take a look now at just a standard curve brush. I'm going to go to Polystar, which has no subdivision levels. Obviously, it's just the Polystar. It's just the null object in ZBrush. I'll go to B for brush, C for curve, and select the curve tube brush. Now you see curve mode is turned on because this is a curve brush. I'll turn my draw size down, and then I'll click and drag, and then that gives me this tube that runs along the curve. Now I can change my curve step if I turn that up, and then click the curve. You see I've got more of a step in between each point on the curve. If I turn this down, I can make that curve more precise. I can snap the curve to the surface by turning on snap if I wanted to snap to what's beneath. I can turn on elastic. If I turn on elastic and then click the end, I can stretch that out or reduce it. If I turn on liquid, you see I get this little line here. Oops, there we go. I can extend that curve. If I turn off liquid and then go to the end, you see I get this little red line. That's just a visual cue that I can extend that curve. We also have the ability to lock our start point. So our start point was here. So if I, let's say, go back to elastic, and let's erase some of this curve here. Let's get that, pull that out, pull that down. Here we go. Let's turn off elastic now and grab that endpoint. We'll zoom out so we've got a little bit more space. You see that start point is locked in space. It will not move. If I go to lock end, and then as I moused over the curve while my brush is blue, you see the start and the end points are now locked, so I can adjust the curve along that distance. If I turn off lock end and then click the start point, the end point moves. If I click the end point, the start point will not move because it is still locked. Now, if we go to curve functions, you see here we can adjust our curve smoothness. We can also frame the mesh. This is when we're using curves to build topology using the topology brush. This will actually frame any holes in the mesh. We can set this to frame borders, polygroups, or creased edges. This is not used for the curved brushes per se. This is used for the topology brushes. We also have the ability to smooth our curve. So if I press smooth, it'll smooth that out. I can snapshot the curve, and then if I click an endpoint, you see it snapshots that curve instance there. So I can then move it, snapshot it again, move it again. I can adjust my curve smoothness. See, that gives me a little bit of a difference there in the smoothness of the curve. If we turn our draw size down, you see we get more of a pinch. Now, most importantly, I think, is curve modifiers. So if I go to curve modifiers here and turn on size, and then open the curve fall off, I have this control here. Now, this curve controls the size of the tube at the beginning of the stroke and at the end of the stroke. So if we undo, and let's just go back to our star here. And if I draw that tube again, it goes from tiny to big. Usually that's not how I want to actually do this, though. I'm usually using this to make a tentacle or a horn, so I'm going to flip this vertically so it goes from big to small. And I'll turn this point up a little bit so it doesn't end at a perfect point. And I get a shape like that, which is perfect for tentacles or horns. If I adjust this curve, I can change the size of it so it'll stay big longer and then descend down into a point. So if I click the curve, it will change its profile. If I want to change the size of the stroke, I just change my draw size while the brush is red and then click, and it will either reduce or enlarge the size of that tube depending on which way I turn my brush size. Now, under inventory, we have the ability to record strokes. So basically, you can use this to record a series of strokes if you want to apply them. Personally, I don't find this as useful as the more simple modifier to replay last. But if you do want to record a sequence of strokes, it is here under inventory. So you can record brush strokes and then export your last stroke or export all once you have some selected. So if I click record and then start recording strokes, each stroke that I do will be recorded, and then I can export them all or export my last stroke or replay all. So if I click replay all, it replays all those strokes. Again, it's not something that I find myself using very often, but because it is here, I did want to mention it. For me, if I'm going to be replaying strokes, typically I will use modifier replay last. Now, the stroke menu, like I said, is essentially controlling how your brush interacts with the surface. It's very important, I think, to understand it and make use of it, because there's all sorts of shapes that you're simply not going to be able to get if you don't use the full capacity of the stroke menu. There's also options in here to control Sculptris Pro. Now, we're going to talk about Sculptris Pro in a separate video. Sculptris Pro is a method of sculpting while tessellating, which is taken from Sculptris, which is a software that's produced by Pixelogic. It's a very, very neat tool. And I recommend that you watch the video on Sculptris Pro on its own, where we talk about these controls. There's two controls for Sculptris Pro. One of them is in the stroke menu. It's a very neat tool, I find, for sketching and blocking in shapes, but it's not really part of this lecture, which is most specifically on the strokes and the curve controls. So that is the stroke menu. If you were to make adjustments to your stroke menu and then save your brush, your stroke settings will save with your brush. So this is part of creating custom brushes. So if you do decide that you want to create, for example, a texture stamp brush, maybe I want to create a brush that just stamps in this alpha texture. So I've got the stroke set to drag rectangle. I've got my alpha set to this particular alpha. Then if I go to brush, save as, it will save those settings. If I go to the freehand stroke and set the arrow alpha, and then go to lazy mouse and turn up my lazy radius, and then go to brush, save as, I can save that brush and these settings will save with it. So this is factored into any brush customizations you do here. So I hope you've enjoyed this video. This is an introduction to the stroke menu. It's a real integral part of sculpting. It's one of those ways that we can get in there and just hack the nuts and bolts of how our brushes apply to the surface. And I think it's very, very important to explore this and get a handle on it so you can really exploit the power of ZBrush brushes to the full extent. Thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next video.